Hello and welcome to East Club. Today's topic, Heinrich Himmler. Hello and welcome back to our history podcast. I'm joined today for the fifth episode by Klaus Diekmann, as always, and we are ready and off. And who are we going to talk about today? But before I say that, Klaus, how have you been?
I've been fine, thank you. We have not had the most eventful of days, I suppose. It has been a bit boring, but let's hope we can spice things up right now. Because we are going to talk about.
Heinrich Himmler. He was born on October 7th in 1900 in Munich, Germany, into a, well, quite not wealthy family, but a middle class family in Germany um, at the time. And his father was the director of a Oberstufen Gymnasium, which is a high school in US terms. Um,
Yes, you were certainly very well to do. So it certainly wasn't a very poor family. It was a rather conservative Catholic family from Bavaria, we should add. So he came from like this sort of well established middle to upper class sort of background in Munich.
Exactly, and Himmler in his young childhood was a very good student. He went to a high school in Landshut, and where he graduated in 1919. And all of his teachers that described him throughout middle school always said that he was a very experienced learner, and he was always quite active in class.
Yes, however, he was sick a lot apparently, so he missed a lot of school time as a child. He was also he didn't exactly conform with the sort of the Aryan ideal that members of the SS, something we'll get into later, should conform to. So he was pretty short, he was very short sighted, he was a rather sickly child, missed a lot of time in school, but through very hard work, apparently, he managed to catch up on what he missed in class. But yes, apart from that, so he also didn't manage to get drafted into the First World War because of his short-sightedness. So he didn't exactly conform with sort of the ideals that the organization he would then later had
Exactly.
demanded. Now, since he missed the war, he also was very downtrodden about that because he came from a very nationalistic background. He was very anti-Semitic as a teenager and was very nationalistic. So missing out on the wars certainly dampened his self-esteem a fair deal, and he then also later became somewhat depressed about the way things turned out.
Exactly. So after he had finished school in 1919, he decided that he would study agronomy at the Technische Hochschule in Munich for about 2-3 years. And following a brief apprenticeship at a farm, um, uh, he got a degree in agriculture, which he then used as one of his first jobs. And after he got his first job, he had a lot of anti-Semitic tendencies, which then led him to be the 42,000th something member of the Nazi Party in 1923.
He wasn't exactly a founding member, but comparatively speaking, he did sign up pretty early.
Exactly, and over his time in the Nazi Party, he learned all the important people that we've talked about. He started to introduce himself, but in the beginning he was not a very important character of the party, but he did join in the beer hall putsch in 1923, which was, as we already kind of discussed, the sole grab of power in Munich by the Nazi Party, which failed in the end. And in this putsch, a lot of people were arrested. Some of them we've already talked about. For Heinrich Himmler, there was not enough evidence that he was part of a scheme, which is why he was not arrested, so he could still work on his local farm job for the next couple of years until the Nazi Party got back in rolling in 1925 when Hitler was released and everything else.
Yes, I mean, he wasn't part of the leadership in the Vehicle Putsch. It occurred on the 9th of November. He'd only just signed up for the NSDAP in August of 1923. So, I mean, and he was also still a very young guy. He was 23 years old, so it wasn't like he was one of the main people were looking out for, though. Participating in the putsch, of course, was treason, but he managed to get away with it. Now, after the failed beer hall putsch, he actually, for a time, moved back into his parents' house, became somewhat depressed and so on. But when the Nazi Party came out of the shadows again and sort of started
February 1925, he joined the Schutzstaffel, which would become very important over the rest of his career, the SS, which was supposed to be not an upgrade, but a more elite kind of security force. And over the SA, which was led by Ernst Rommel. We haven't
Ernst Röhm.
Ernst Röhm. It's not Rommel, sorry, Ernst Röhm. We haven't talked about him before, but he kind of had this group of very untrained individuals that beat up people in the streets, and it was not very elite, and this is what he was out to change, which is why he founded the SS, which was the Schutzstaffel.
Or became a very early member.
Or became a very early member, and was kind of a founder, and later even started to lead this thing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And in this process, the main goal was to have a very Aryan elite task force that would not be as brutal, well, not be as uncontrolled.
Yes, essentially the the SA, they were essentially just like thugs, like drunken people, like the mob. Essentially, they would just be running around beating people up at random, sort of having street fights with communists and so on. And those would just also they would have like these very tacky uniforms, and they would be like these oftentimes just these gangster types, but the SS was something different. Those were people, often they came from like very highly respectable households in society, or at least so they thought of themselves. They would also choose their members according to like their um, they would be very strict in their admissions, so they would only let people join who would conform with like the
Ideology.
yeah, who would conform with not only the ideology but also the ideal of like a perfect Aryan man. So they would have to be like tall, blonde, blue-eyed. Yeah, something you certainly, but Mr. but Mr. Heinrich Himmler certainly was not. He was only like 5'8" and dark-haired and
Had a couldn't see very well.
Yes,
Which was not very part of the ideal.
It was sort of like Winnie the Pooh signing up for SS, essentially.
Exactly. In 1927, he got his next real career upgrade when he was appointed deputy propaganda chief for the NSDAP, giving him another sense of responsibility. It just shows that he climbed up the ladder over time. And he believed in the ideology. That's why he got this, let's say, position.
Yes, we should also mention, we have already mentioned sort of his Catholic background with his family in Bavaria. It is very important to understand that next to this Catholic background, also the nationalistic part also was very, very important for Heinrich Himmler, and it seems like sort of his faith in the Catholic Church sort of took a back seat once he was in the Nazi Party. So he also married a Protestant wife, something we'll get into, something his family was very, very unhappy about. And he also became very interested in sort of a bit occultish kind of things. You can spend a lot of time reading about like certain opinions he had. He was not like a bona fide intellectual the way something that Joseph Goebbels, for instance, would fancy himself as, but he certainly was someone who spent a lot of time reading up on like these very nationalistic, sort of Aryan, pre-Christianic German traditions and so on, and would participate in all these in many of these like occultish things that were happening around the Nazi Party at the time.
And then another personal milestone that Heinrich Himmler had was in 1928 when he married his beloved wife Margarete Boden. And something that is very interesting about this wedding is that none of Himmler's family members actually attended the wedding, which is always interesting to point out because it doesn't seem like it was a very accepted marriage if nobody shows up from your side. But they lived happily, at least for the first couple of years, and they also had a daughter named I believe it must be Gudrun. Is it Gudrun?
Yes, it is Gudrun. Now, Margarete Boden, his family did not accept Margarete Boden solely on the grounds of her being Catholic. Now, she was, of her being Protestant, I mean, she also was 7 years his senior. That one should probably also add something that at the time was very unusual, I guess. I mean, there were like certain people who would manage to get away with it and so on, but at the time it was certainly very much frowned upon. I guess today is also far from being the norm. And she was also a divorcee, so I mean, of course, she was a bit older, so that's also puts the family off a bit. Now, something that is interesting is, I think this sort of shows his relationship, his marriage with Margarete Boden, once with his faith and also with his sort of nationalistic tendencies, because Margarete Boden, one of the reasons he married her was that she sort of conformed with his prototype of what like an Aryan lady should be.
His ideas. She was blonde and she was tall and she was light skinned and she had blue eyes and she just portrayed the perfect Aryan woman. And even though he wasn't really the perfect Aryan man, it was kind of making a statement of marrying her and having a perfect Aryan woman as his wife.
Well, sort of something that is quite interesting with me, with Himmler, is that I think his self-esteem is very important. Sort of, he also, we'll see this later, he often thought of himself as like this guy in the tradition of like various Roman.
His SS unit was shaped after the Roman, the Roman National Guard, the most important. And he had things implemented such as I believe it said loyalty is first
or loyalty is honor.
Loyalty is honor. Yes. Of SS members.
And so sort of I think he really had an ego. You can also see this here. I think also with his marriage, you know, he really sort of needed this for himself. Also later when he sort of wanted to, we'll get to this, but when he wanted to sort of enter into negotiations with the Americans, he wanted it to be me who gets to talk to like Eisenhower.
Exactly. He had an own mind. Let's say that.
Yes.
But before he starts any negotiations with the Allies in 1929, Hitler still thinks of him as a very loyal servant, not a loyal follower. So in January 6, 1929, he gets appointed Reichsführer of SS, so the chief of the SS, which makes him one of the most powerful men of the Nazi Party. And later on, of course, also in Germany, as soon as the Nazi Party reaches power 4 years later. And this is where he starts having all these ideas about how he wants to create the perfect National Guard, and it becomes not more of a security service, but more of a personal force for Hitler and anything he wants to do with the force. And at the beginning, the SS was, I believe, somewhere at 100 men.
Yes, in the beginning
it was very small, and it's not quite here, but at least mid-1930s they had over 50,000 men and different units, and yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing with the SS is that it sort of grew and grew, but it still was supposed to have a certain exclusivity to it, and also the SS, it was something that Hitler wanted to have total control over. Essentially, with the SA, there were people like Gregor Strasser or Ernst Röhm, who sort of also tried to have at least their own sort of basis of power. And that was something Hitler sort of wanted to circumvent with the SS, who was personally loyal to him, and with the help of the SS he could then also maintain order within the ranks even of his own party. And Himmler was essentially his guy, his yes man, who could make this happen, along with, well, we'll later get to Reinhard Heydrich. And the interesting thing with the SS is also that with that it was ideologically far more important to the Nazis than the SA, because the SA, those were these thugs essentially, and I can't. We're working on it. I'm working on my TH, okay. And the SS, those were the hand-picked racial prototypes who would then also get to mate and procreate as
Exactly, there was actually a law in place later on that SS men are, it is a crime against the state, I believe, if you refuse an SA man as a woman, SS man as a woman.
Yes, I think certain women were sort of picked to procreate with them.
Exactly, and they were not allowed to say no in some kind
to
of
produce
sense.
Like the perfect Aryan children, yeah.
Exactly, so they can have a constant reproduction cycle, pretty kind of similar to Spartanians, if you want, if you know the combination, as they had the same kind of thing that Spartans were allowed to have multiple wives. Spartans.
Spartans.
Yeah, exactly. So there's some connections to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and any kind of perfect soldier ideal that has been in history. This is pretty much what they were. And the next thing that the other things were that they were supposed to have multiple wives. So everything was for them to, the perfect opportunity for them to mate.
Yes, to increase the amount of Aryans in the gene pool. It's like a social Darwinism thing, essentially, to not be outdone by like the all the other evil races and so on. You want to.
And then in 1933, the Nazis obtained control over the German state, and Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor, which then, which follows on March 9th, is that Himmler is then appointed President of the Police in Munich, giving him another state title, which he has under his control, and just more power and just a manifest of power now over nationwide, not just as before over one single party.
Yes, we should also mention Himmler was certainly involved in the Röhm coup.
No, that's next. That's 34. Oh. Exactly, I'm getting to that.
I'm sorry.
And as already kind of teased by my co-host, he was always kind of, Röhm was a kind of he was in his way. He always had power, but he always was kind of in the shadow of Röhm and his SA and his thugs, and he wanted to have complete control of the police force in Germany, with the SS being the only police force, which is why he then gets to the Night of the Long Knives, which Klaus already teased, so I'll let him talk about it.
Well, we'll not talk too much about the Night of the Long Knives, I guess that is common knowledge by now, but Hitler, essentially, he needed to get Ernst Röhm, who was like the other, essentially, pole in the Nazi party that people gathered around and so on. He was, of course, far less important than the Reichschancellor, but he certainly also had his own ideas about gaining power and his own political agenda that was more or less independent from Hitler. Now, he was very useful to Hitler, of course, when they had to win street fights against the communists and so on, and against the Social Democrats. But once Hitler had a firm grip on power, had locked them all up, the biggest danger towards Hitler's power came from within his own party, from Röhm. So he was very happy to depose Röhm and Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler. They were certainly not opposed to that idea, since that would, of course, also infinitely increase their base of power once they got the bloody SS out of the way. That was sort of their thinking. So they even managed to out of the way, exactly, in favor of their SS. And they even managed to convince Hitler to have Röhm murdered or killed, depending on your viewpoint, whilst Hitler just wanted to, lock him up or deport him or get rid of him in some other way. But they were very adamant, and that also kind of shows that Himmler, he certainly was an independent thinker. He was no absolute yes man follower type like Rudolf Hess or Goebbels on his worst days. No, he was someone who certainly was more self-centered and certainly also was very sort of had a strong ego and felt very strongly about certain concepts like Lebensraum and so on, but he also looked out for himself, and the universe revolved around him, not around
some
Hitler.
Important numbers, just let's say as just a bonus fact. The SA, as I mentioned, the thugs, at this point they had 3 million members in the SA. So that was not a very elite force if you have 3 million members, compared to the SS, which was the elite force and at 52,000 members at that point. So there's the difference between them, and there's also the reason why Heinrich Himmler and others, Hitler and everybody else they wanted complete control of the police force, and they could judge who does what. And in this time, they also the new kind of formed, the Gestapo formed out of the SS, which was kind of a security service of Third Reich at that point, and this was also formed out of the SS, but it's not as important for his later career, I believe, as it was more of Heydrich's thing.
Yes.
Exactly.
Now, something that SS was also, of course, tasked to was to find an adequate solution for, essentially the question, what are we going to do about all these Jewish people in Europe? That was occupying the Nazis.
And this kind of exponentially grew over time. This is the importance of this idea as suddenly they started a war in 1939, and at that point they were collecting more and more Jews and
they were kind of trying to put things into practice by then. They sort of at first they wanted to increase their grip on power, build up Germany's economy and the military strength for a couple of years between 1933 and 1939, and then after, once having hosted the Olympic Games, getting control over Austria, over the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, they then, eventually...
just an important date for Heinrich Himmler that you don't need to know, but on June 17th, 1936, he has then been announced the chief of German police. So at that point, he commands all of German police.
Yes.
And that's just an important fact for him and his career, because I guess it was very important.
And he was also a very young guy. He was 36 at the time.
Exactly. He was kind of very... He always did what he had to do.
Yes, it's interesting because something that fascinates me is sort of when you compare how old certain or most figures in the Nazi party were, in the Nazi hierarchy. Everyone who wielded, or nearly everyone who wielded significant power in World War II wasn't older than 50. I mean, Hitler was in his early 40s when he became Chancellor, born 1889, also with Goering, with Hess, with Himmler, and most other figures that we are covering in our podcast, this is the case. So that is something I was always fascinated by, because today in politics you would think of them as these like very young usurpers who have all somehow managed to get into power, but back then I guess they were also regarded as young, but they weren't. It wasn't something people talked about that much, I guess.
I will jump into 1939 if that's okay right now.
Yeah, I mean, what we should...
We should, of course, have the different plans that the eradication
but
of the Jews, but I will get that at 1941 and later on. So in 1939, Germany invades Poland and they start World War II, which is important to note for the SS, as at this point they become a partly military unit. So they have about 38 divisions throughout World War II, which have the job of eradicating at the beginning or any kind of not seen as humans or under-humans by the Nazi Party in the new conquered lands. So these military units, they would arrive at the conquered destinations shortly after the military had conquered these cities, and then eradicate all kinds of Jews, Bolsheviks, anything that the Nazi Party didn't see as necessary or a waste of resources, pretty much. And this was very inefficient at the time. And this is the reason why they founded a committee which was called, which was the Reich Security Main Office, and this was entrusted on coordinating the annihilation of all European Jews. Yes. And this is what Klaus is going to talk about.
So, interestingly enough, there were many different plans that were being discussed how to solve, as the Nazis would call it, the Jewish question. Himmler, he initially actually was not necessarily in favor of genocide, although that of course quickly changed. Now, his sort of idea was to deport all Jews from Europe. That was of course not necessarily easy, because you first have to find a place where you can deport them to. Now, Himmler was sort of looking at the map, and he was trying to find like different locations where he could do that to. This is a very interesting historical footnote. So he reasoned that sending them to Palestine, although that of course would be sort of the more natural thing to do, and something that one maybe would have also been able to convince many of the to be deported to do, since Theodor Herzl, that was something, that was a place many Jewish people were emigrating to anyway. He sort of feared that that would be a bad idea, since they could then establish a second Jewish Rome in Jerusalem and control the world from there. I mean, Israel, after all, Palestine is located in a very central spot, and Himmler also always had like these big, and ancient myths, ancient sagas and so on in the back of his head. So that wasn't a possibility. So he was trying to find a different place that was sort of less central, a bit more low-key, and his finger on the map stopped at Madagascar. Now, why Madagascar? It does sound like a random choice, doesn't it? Well, his reasoning was that the Germans, after conquering France, I mean, um, they sort of controlled Madagascar in many ways because they sort of had a certain amount of control over the Vichy government, and Madagascar was a French colony, so he thought, yeah, sure, that's kind of feasible. Um, Now, Madagascar had very few inhabitants, apart from the local population. There were like 25,000 European settlers, and Himmler thought that he would deport all Western and North European Jews there. So about approximately around about 4 million people, all Eastern European Jews he would sort of round up also in one big camp, and then sort of use them as hostages and as leverage in the war. But yes, all the Western European Jews should be shipped in quantities of, I can't say quantities, those are people I'm talking about.
Maybe not the best thing to do.
Yeah,
but in
1 million people per year should be shipped
yeah,
to
exactly. That was his
Madagascar.
idea. And just speaking about the logistics of such an operation, trying to ship 1 million people a year across sea to a remote island that is mainly jungle and beaches with no real infrastructure.
Very mountainous.
Very mountainous,
With
high
malaria.
elevation, and a lot of diseases. The diseases, I guess, was not the problem, that the safety of the Jews was their main problem. But the reason this whole plan came to fail is because they believed they did not have enough sea dominance to have such an upscale operation across that would be Atlantic, would it?
Well,
Atlantic.
In general, the Atlantic, but also, I mean, you do have to go through the Atlantic to get to Madagascar, but also in general, the British naval blockade was then by then a bit too strong for them to
exactly
make such ideas possible. And also, Madagascar was conquered back by the French resistance eventually, and the costs just absolutely bonkers logistics make that plan
exactly
unfeasible. But it does prove an interesting point, and that was that Himmler was not necessarily that they were contemplating sort of many different alternatives to the Holocaust and so on, or at least the way they executed it, although that certainly was not due to the safety of the poor Jews. Now, that was, by the way, the Rademacher plan we were talking about.
And now we're going to go, I guess, to the next solution, which is the one that actually happened, and it is quite tragic, which is the Holocaust solution, which was which was signed at the Wannsee-Konferenz.
Yes. I believe it was the 20th of April 1942. So that was a lot later in the war. Now, before that, they had, of course, also been already, committing genocide. However, and just rounding up Jews, Bolsheviks, communists,
and
whatever.
And shooting them into mass graves.
Yes, and then filling them back up.
Which the main problem for Himmler was, at least this is what he stated, was that it was demoralizing the troops, because killing multiple, like the units that he had throughout of his SS, which were military units, who were doing this job, because killing multiple thousands of people a day maybe was not one of the most motivating tasks you can have. And they would have to be all killed either by bullet or by hand, to be honest.
Yeah, or like guillotine or something.
Guillotine or fire. So it was kind of very hands-on work. So you weren't not as late.
Oh gosh,
hands-on as a
you're getting us into trouble
Exactly.
now.
When you talk about them in a later context, with the Holocaust, they didn't have that as much of a connection to the mass murders as at that point, which is the reason why it was also chosen later on.
Yes, of course, it was also very. It was not only very taxing on like the psyches of the soldiers committing these murders, which is quite interesting. That is like such a strong calculation. But I guess you know, with human nature being such a strong obstacle, you know, when it comes to killing people, that is also then just you know what's going to happen eventually. Now, they were also for various logistical reasons just not managing to kill the amount of people they
At least not efficiently.
wanted to, exactly.
And it was high costs.
So essentially, yes, we can. What one can call the Holocaust, I guess, is genocide or mass slaughter industrialized.
In the most efficient way possible.
Exactly, that was the plan. So they had to come up with a way to do that if they weren't able to deport all of the Jews. So what did they do? They had to, they first, you know, with any plan, they, you know, have to have a conference first and have a planning stage. And the planning for this, that was the Wannsee Conference, a conference held in Berlin, organized by his good old pal Reinhard Heydrich, and of course by Heinrich Himmler. And that was on the 20th of January 1942. I don't know if I've mentioned that in this recording.
I think you're already repeating yourself.
Yeah, I'm repeating myself. So yes, that was what the Wannsee Conference was about, planning. And
the solution was, as everybody knows, the Holocaust, which in effect were concentration camps in which Jews were shipped from the ghettos, which were already established at that point, through the SS and other organizations in the Nazi Party. And they were killed in the most efficient way possible, either by the easy way, which was going into the gas chamber, which was it took about a Jew 15 minutes to die as soon as they arrived, until they were on a pile of corpses.
Yes.
You can say in 15 minutes.
We are not only
But also there was the second way, and that was the way that the people who were able to work, or at least were deemed able to work, died mostly of starvation, diseases, very inhumane conditions, and they were not treated as humans, to be honest. And this was how the Holocaust came to be, and Heinrich Himmler played a big role in it.
Yes, I think we are talking about, we shouldn't forget, we are talking about, that is a good sentence in general when dealing with the Holocaust. Now, we are talking about 5.6 to 6.3 million Jews, as well as approximately 6 million other people of various political ideologies, communists, but also other religious groups such as Social Democrats, I guess, also anarchists and so on, various other religious groups, Sinti and Roma. I guess there are more religious than an ethnic group, Jehovah's Witnesses, and then Himmler was also rather instrumental in the murder of homosexuals. That was something that was apparently very close to his heart of stone, and something he was very adamant about. We were the other day discussing sort of Reinhard. We were discussing Rudolf Hess and Hitler possibly having like a homosexual relationship. That's probably more rumor than actual historical fact, but considering like the comparatively speaking low amounts of homosexuals that were murdered in the Holocaust, I don't know if that was something that Himmler really had to push so that it happened. But I am very badly educated. I should have looked this up beforehand. But yeah, so
I would say the end of the war is the next real chapter.
yes, certainly.
So, instead of Himmler, as we already had mentioned, was never the most. He was quite loyal, but he was always thinking for himself. And as the war came to an end, and he was seeing also that the Germans were about to lose, he decided, how do I get out of a situation in my best interest, not in the best interest of the Third Reich, not in the best interest of Adolf Hitler, but in his own best interest. So he thought, I should at least try to get some kind of alliance going with the Allies. In his case, so he tried to appeal to, I believe it was the French government, as well as Roosevelt.
Yes, he was talking to a Swedish diplomat, and essentially with him, he sort of his hope was that he could establish connections to the Americans, Eisenhower, to the French government, to the British, and interestingly enough, not with the Russians. Hitler's hope was that he could negotiate in a very fancy suit with Himmler's hope, not Hitler's. Yes, Himmler's hope was that he could negotiate in a very fancy suit with all these very important people and look very, very, very good on these newspaper photos and have his ego trip fulfilled. And B, he could stop the war on the Western Front so that Germany could still pursue their war against Russia, or at least try to save as much of the Reich as they could in the east, and evacuate German soldiers back to Germany. So, since they were fighting on two fronts, all of this was very resource intensive, and he was sort of hoping to alleviate the pressure from the West. Now, of course, that wasn't going to happen. He was sort of laughed at by many authorities, so that didn't work. However, he still had various sort of contingency plans for himself, and was certainly coming up with all kinds of ideas how he could spend his future after the war.
And one of the things which now I am personally, I don't know where you are right now, Klaus, from a time period here, but I'm at April 20th, when there was the Führer's birthday in Berlin, which was the last.
Oh, we're talking about 1945. Yes.
You were between 44 and 45.
I was sort of talking from 1943 onwards. That is when historians say that he was sort of coming up with various plans, because at that point that was, the turning point in the war.
Yeah, I know.
With Stalingrad and where things started to go south.
Do you have anything very important to add to 44? We have a very long episode.
Yes, 44 was the assassination attempt on Hitler of Klaus von Stauffenberg. And interestingly enough, Himmler apparently had various contacts to people, the extent of which is rather ambiguous, to various conservative circles who probably were in some capacity planning to assassinate and rid themselves of Hitler, still keep the German Reich as it was, but then, end the war and try to rebuild what they could in Germany. Those were the realists, in quotations, less absolutely fanatic Hitler-ish ideologues who wanted to fight to the last man.
Exactly, and there's conspiracies that he was associated with this kind of assassination as he had the option, I believe it was 3 days earlier, to arrest two of the men that carried out the assassination through his SS, but denied this command on lack of evidence. And therefore, people have this conspiracy that he might have known about it or at least was part of it, and he did this knowingly that he denied the arrest, as well as that he at this time had already this all of these different plots going with the Allies. So he was not the most loyal person ever. And something interesting Klaus wants to add is that Heinrich Himmler wasn't also the most loyal in combination to Hitler, but he was also not very loyal to his wife, which is we're kind of going back a bit, as this is in 1941 from 1939 to 1941, where he had an affair, and they were actually not a couple anymore after the 1940s at least. But they were also not divorced, but because for their kid, but at least he had a very different personal life.
Yes.
That was just an anecdote I had to add. I'm sorry.
Yes, exactly. He had an affair with his secretary, fathered two other children, but also always remained very, very close to his daughter. So something people put this down to is essentially his wife and his daughter were living in Munich. He was working in Berlin, and then it was sort of the back and forth. His job was probably very stressful, and his wife was also quite a bit older than him. So for like a very ego-driven man who, wants to always be together with like the young, blonde, Aryan prototypes in quotations, that is of course something that he then probably was also somewhat distraught about. But yes, that is also rather interesting. However, these children were, of course, sparsely acknowledged. Now, but it becomes quite interesting towards its end. Now, after all of these plans to negotiate fail in sort of April of 1945, Hitler learns about these plans to negotiate.
Which is interesting.
2 days before his death.
What's interesting about this is that in 1920, on April 20th, 1945, it's Hitler's birthday, yeah, and he has this kind of elaborate dystopian party in midst of Berlin, which is completely bombed out in the bunker. And everybody is invited from the Nazi, including Heinrich Himmler, and they have this weird celebration as if nothing was going on and everything was going great. And it's the Soviets are just in front of the gates of Berlin. I think they were like 30 kilometers away from where they were actually celebrating, and it's a very weird scenario.
Yes.
And at this point, he was already in contact with the Allies for a long time, and he was having all these ideas. And on April 28th, he actually he wants to surrender the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces, claiming that Hitler had killed himself at this point, which he does 2 days later, but hadn't at this point. And he was negotiating as the new Reichsführer of Germany, which he wasn't, and they didn't see him that way, and nothing very ever came of this, except that Hitler knew of his attempt of trying to get some kind of deal for himself or for Germany, without him actually being the Reichsführer and any of his commands, and therefore he strips him of all his offices and orders his arrest on April 29th.
Yes, Hitler deemed this betrayal the greatest betrayal in history. Yeah, this also sort of reveals a bit of the quality of Himmler's, and that is, in contrast, we've got sort of Goebbels with his wife Magdalena, and they are down in the bunker with their 6 kids, staying with Hitler until the very end, and then also killing all of them themselves, including the kids, and they are sort of super loyal, stick with Hitler, and so on. But that was not stick with Hitler. That was not at all Himmler's approach. He made sure that he got out of there, and with the idea that now that the Führer is dead, can sort of take the reins of power into my own hands and exercise some power for myself. Down in the bunker, of course, as you mentioned, they were sort of celebrating like the
8 days earlier,
sinking of the Titanic. They were having all of these very wild parties and whatnot, and the various generals were often drinking themselves under the table, and Adolf and Eve were having their time. Now, after Eva Braun muttered her famous last words, "worst honeymoon ever."
Well, on April 30th, then Hitler committed suicide, and it actually came true what Himmler was predicting 2 days earlier, that Hitler was dead. But he was
completely nuts.
He had no titles at this point, obviously, and also the Allies didn't really want to make a deal with him after all, because they didn't see any. His actions were still killing millions of Jews and being part of this whole thing. And even if he tried to point out that he was not the bad guy in the scenario, he definitely was, yes. And everybody knew this. So when on May 7th, Nazi Germany then signs the surrender documents with Karl Dönitz, as we talked about in our first episode, just to quick revisit if you haven't seen it already.
Yes, we were.
And on May 8th, I believe, they actually meet in Plön. Plön is this is just an anecdote out of our lives. Plön is a very nice place to be. You can go canoeing there nowadays. It's very fabulous. You can have a great time. But you wanted to add something.
Exactly. Now, sort of timeline-wise, essentially, Hitler kills himself. Then Goebbels becomes Vice Chancellor a day later. He kills himself, and then the chancellorship goes to a Baron Schwerin-Krosigk, exactly, and Dönitz is president.
Exactly,
and they are in Schleswig-Holstein, so that is sort of our state. It is essentially, or at least my home state, it is essentially north of Hamburg. Yes, you live like 100 meters from the borders away. Yes, so the surrender signing is then 8th of May. They also meet in Plön shortly before. However, the new government, they don't require the assistance of Heinrich Himmler anymore. They are just, when he shows up and says, "I'm happy to work together with you guys," they let him go. Both parties are armed. There's sort of very fierce standoff, but essentially they manage to part peacefully. The government then soon afterwards moves further up to Flensburg-Mühlvik. Listen to the Dönitz episode if you want to know how things go on for them. Now Himmler, he's sort of out on his own. He's running.
Exactly. He's kind of trying to stay under the radar, not get captured at all. And he does get captured after all on May 20th, 1945, by Russian soldiers.
By British, actually.
No, it says.
Are you sure? Russian soldiers?
Russian. Or British or Russian soldiers.
The Russian soldiers capture Himmler and turn him over to the British. That was the story I remember. Yeah.
Exactly. And and he's captured somewhere in
very close to Hamburg.
Very close to Hamburg in Niedersachsen.
Yes, he's then he's sort of captured, I believe, very close to Hamburg, and then he's moved to Lüneburg.
But interestingly, how he's captured is it's kind of weird because he was with his group of personal guards, you can say, but all they were all disguised as normal common foot soldiers coming back from the war. With no real place to go, he was wearing an eye patch, and which is kind of something you just don't have to know, really. But he was wearing an eye patch.
Well, it's so cool. Come on, wearing an eye patch.
And he was captured. And after 2 days, I think it was 2 days of being captured as a normal foot soldier and treated as a normal foot soldier, his ego burst out, and he had to tell everybody who he was.
He blew his cover.
And he thought that this would make his life situation better. But as something you have to know about Nazi leaders is that they always had
they were a bit unpopular with the Allies. Let's put it this way. Their standing was not that high, actually.
Exactly.
And the British, they didn't treat them the way Himmler unfortunately expected.
And they always had some kind of suicide capsule on them if they ever got arrested. And this was the case in Himmler too. He had it in the back of his mouth or at the top of his mouth, somewhere in his mouth. And when he was, when the British found out who he actually was, they didn't want any suicide attempts, so they asked him to strip naked and
have a medical examination.
And he did do this, and he also had the medical examination. But as soon as the doctor tried to examine his mouth, he realized that it was either death or imprisonment forever, and he bit down on his cyanide capsule. I don't think it was cyanide.
And died 12 minutes later.
And on his poisonous capsule, and died 12 minutes later, even though the British tried to kind of clear him of all the poison.
Yes, but it didn't work. Sad.
And that's the end of Heinrich Himmler.
Yes, that literally is the end of him. Now, yes, with his wife still, they weren't on the best terms during the last days. However, they still did meet up. She still stayed faithful to him, and he also he managed to meet his daughter Gudrun on, I believe, shortly before the 20th of April. So still, while things were sort of getting out of hand, also privately for most Nazi officials. Now, interestingly, Gudrun, she only recently died. We were actually only just reading up on this. At aged 88 in 2018, she actually never renounced her dad at all. After spending some time as a prisoner in Italy, sort of as a child with her mother, she eventually made it back to Germany, later married a member of the NPD, an official there. That is like a sort of neo-Nazi party we've gotten here in Germany. Gosh, horrible people. And yes, if you still desire to meet a descendant of Heinrich Himmler, I think is to kids that were born out of wedlock. One of them is called Helge. I think they're sort of born in the early 1940s, 1942, 1944. They're still around. So somewhere. Yes. I don't know where they are.
Exactly, and I think that rounds up our episode for today on Heinrich Himmler. There's not much more to talk about on the guy.
Well, it gets a bit depressing after a long while.
We thank everybody who's still here for listening. I hope you enjoyed our 5th episode on on our Nazi leaders. This will be the second to last one. We have one more coming up in this season, and we hope you will listen to that one too. And therefore, all I gotta say is bye bye.
Auf Wiedersehen. See you again.
See you again.